Hello and welcome back to our channel. Everything I create is purely speculative and based on personal opinions. Is the new clue Jacob has found truly the final breakthrough or merely a ticket into a deadly trap? Joey and Bill both seem suspicious, but what if the one behind it all is actually Doug, the man everyone believed was dead? How would Jacob face that truth? Is Doug really alive? Or is he just a shadow someone has raised to manipulate everyone's suspicions? In those days, Fairmont Crest still wore its usual mask of false peace, with spotless white walls, perfectly trimmed gardens, and gleaming luxury cars gliding silently by as if sin had never existed there. But beneath that polished surface, something was rotting from within. Jacob felt it more clearly than anyone. He had stayed too long in the role of a man standing close to the plasma ring. So long that sometimes he no longer knew where the instincts of an investigator ended and the numbness of someone who had seen too much filth without being able to destroy it immediately began. The greatest problem was not that he failed to suspect Joey or Bill, or that he was not watching Randy. The problem was that every piece of evidence existed in exactly the way a very intelligent hand wanted him to see it. Close enough to keep hope alive, clear enough to suggest a direction, yet false enough that any conclusion could collapse the very next minute. Just when Jacob began to believe he was only one step away from the truth, all the earlier links in the chain suddenly seemed to change color. Delivery schedules that had once followed a pattern became chaotic. Faces that had once appeared regularly around the hospital vanished all at once or shifted roles. An internal file that had seemed lost suddenly appeared in his hands, but it was suspiciously clean, as though someone had carefully wiped away every fingerprint and placed it exactly where he would find it. Jacob knew that feeling all too well. It was not luck, it was an invitation. And in this world, an invitation was often the first step toward being buried alive. The final clue came to him in a way that was far too perfect to reassure him. An old plasma batch number matched a shipment that had disappeared from the system months earlier. Alongside it was a short note, vague yet provocative, hinting that the true mastermind had never really left the game, but had simply allowed everyone to believe he had vanished. Jacob first thought of Bill, because Bill had power, the ability to move people around, and enough cold intelligence to keep his own hands clean. But then one small detail in the file sent a chill through him. The timestamp attached to the first plasma batch in the network matched, with eerie precision, the period immediately after Doug's reported death, not before, not later. Exactly as if a man had to die on paper for a dark empire to be born in the shadows. That thought made Jacob angry in a very particular way. Not the impulsive rage of a man who felt insulted, but the slow-burning fury of someone realizing he may have been deceived by an entire system for a very long time. Doug was a name pushed into the past, framed as a tragedy, a death that had closed a painful chapter. If Doug was truly alive, then it would not merely upend the investigation. It would be a disgusting betrayal of everyone who had mourned him, suffered because of him, and continued living after his death with the belief that at least one truth had not been twisted. Jacob did not want to believe it, but the more he resisted the idea, the more he was forced to examine it closely. Joey now began to look like a layer of fog deliberately shielding something larger. Every trail had once led toward him, from the shady meetings to the strange silences during sensitive delivery windows. But Joey was too obvious, too frequently placed at the center. Too much like a name meant to absorb all suspicion. Jacob began to understand that in a network as sophisticated as the Plasma Syndicate, the person truly at the top would never allow himself to become the first face others thought of. Joey might know a great deal, he might be involved, he might be dirty. But his kind of dirt looked more like that of a coordinator or mid-level protector than a true kingpin. That made Jacob even more uneasy, because if Joey was only the middle layer, then the person above him had to be ruthless enough to sacrifice any pawn without blinking. Bill was no different. His name always carried danger, because his power did not need display to warp the situation around him. But the more Jacob watched, the more he realized Bill behaved like a man tied to the consequences rather than the architect of the entire machine. Bill might have profited. He might have ignored certain warning signs. He might even have shielded someone for personal reasons. But if he were the one at the top, the plasma network would not have needed so many layers of misdirection. A man like Bill would have chosen a more direct, colder, and more efficient path. And that, ironically, dragged Jacob back toward the name he hated thinking about most, Doug. As the possibility that Doug was still alive began to take shape, everything around Jacob seemed distorted. He was no longer just tracking a criminal. He was digging into a grave that may never have held a body. And if the accident years ago had not been an accident but a perfectly staged disappearance, then the person who orchestrated it could not have been Doug alone. There had to be help. There had to be a hand inside the system. There had to be someone with enough access to records, enough composure to manipulate procedures, and enough cruelty to turn a fake death into a living shield for all these years. That was why Randy's name began to rise more clearly. Not because he seemed the smartest, but because he was always there at the right place, at the right time. Like someone important enough to transport things, but vague enough never to remain the center of suspicion for too long. He could be the mole, he could be the inside supplier. He could be the link between the hospital and the network outside. But Jacob also felt something too easy in the way all suspicion seemed to slide toward Randy, and that very ease made him hesitate. Maybe Randy was only a pawn meant to absorb the fatal blow if the network was exposed. Maybe he knew part of the truth but had never seen the whole board. Maybe he was greedy, reckless, and foolish enough to believe he was working beside the real boss when in truth he was only a marked sacrifice waiting for the right moment. That thought left Jacob even more frustrated. Because the most terrifying thing in a large conspiracy was not that there were many bad people. It was that too many people believed they were in control while all of them were being led by an invisible hand. The tension escalated when Jacob discovered that an old security camera from the hospital's secondary storage wing had been almost completely erased, yet a few distorted frames remained. In the one frame clear enough to matter, a man with a familiar walk appeared in a restricted hallway on the very night a large plasma shipment vanished. His face could not be seen. The angle was sideways, the light was broken. But the way he kept his shoulders slightly lowered, walked heavily without rushing, and tilted his head as if measuring the space around him made Jacob go still. That was the kind of detail no one could imitate perfectly unless the impersonator had lived too long in that shadow. For the first time, Jacob felt he was no longer hunting evidence, but being drawn into a psychological game designed to grind away at his reason. From that point on, his anger was no longer directed at just one suspect. He was angry at Joey for his filthy ambiguity. Angry at Bill for the gray zones he might have tolerated. Angry at Randy for his suspicious presence. But above all, he was angry at himself for allowing the case to drag on this long, for allowing too many people to keep playing their roles, for giving a network that fed on others enough time to sink its roots so deeply. And beneath that anger was a very real fear. What if he had already been exposed long ago? What if the final clue was not a key, but a knock on the door announcing it was time for a purge? What if the person behind all of this already knew exactly who he was, had watched him struggle through this maze for so long, and was simply waiting for him to step into the final wrong room? The moment Jacob prepared to move the little evidence he had obtained out of the system, another blow hit, as if the plasma network had decided to tighten the noose around his neck. A shipment was intercepted at the wrong moment. An intermediate witness vanished without a trace. An internal report was altered at the last minute, turning the whole direction of the investigation into something false. Everything happened in such quick succession that it no longer felt like spontaneous reaction. This was a coordinated counterattack. And that confirmed Jacob's deepest fear. Someone inside already knew he was getting too close. Not a vague suspicion. They knew exactly which path he was following. In that instant, Doug was no longer just a possibility. He became a strategic ghost. If he was alive, he had not returned by revealing himself as some miraculous survivor. He had returned by letting his name move first, by letting the obsession surrounding him creep into people's minds first, by forcing everyone to destroy one another with suspicion before he ever showed his real face. That was the most diseased form of revenge, and also the most effective way to seize power. He did not need to appear. He only needed the living to tear each other apart, mistrust each other, and clear the road for him. Jacob understood that if Doug was real, the first person he would want silenced would not be Joey or Randy. It would be anyone sharp enough to realize the plasma network was not running for money alone. Behind it lay old hatred, distortions born from a past that had never truly been buried, and the desire to control those who had gone on living without him. If Doug was alive, he would not simply want to rule the operation. He would want to rewrite the entire story of his own death, of those who were pitied, and of those who had to pay. In that sense, plasma was only the tool. Power was the true goal, revenge was the deepest motive. The closer Jacob came to that conclusion, the more impossible it became to turn back. He no longer had enough time to wait for a perfect by-the-book piece of evidence. But he also knew that one wrong move would bring everything crashing down on him, turning him into a paranoid man clinging to the ghost of someone dead. That was the wicked brilliance of this trap. It did not need to kill Jacob immediately. It only needed to strip him of credibility, direction, and the trust of those who might have saved him. Then, whether Doug was real or not, Jacob would still be the first one buried. And so he made the most dangerous decision of the entire case. Instead of rushing to accuse anyone, Jacob chose to step back and pretend he had taken the bait leading toward Randy. He let a few small signals leak out, enough for the other side to believe he was preparing to place all suspicion on Randy as the sole mole. If someone truly was controlling the game from behind the curtain, that person would have to react to protect the larger disguise. It was a desperate move because it meant Jacob was turning himself into live bait. But with every escape route already broken, he had no choice left except to force the darkness to move on its own. What terrified him was that the darkness really did move. A new piece of information reached Jacob that night, unsigned and without a source. Nothing more than an old location connected to Doug's accident years ago and a chilling reminder that some bodies were never found. Only stories written cleverly enough to make the living stop digging. In that instant, Jacob knew he had touched the nerve of the person behind it all. Doug's name was no longer a harmless illusion. It had just been used as a deliberate warning. If that was truly Doug, then he was daring Jacob to walk into the old graveyard of his own past. If it was an imposter, then that person understood Doug to a horrifying degree. Both possibilities were bad in their own ways. But what chilled Jacob most was not the question of whether Doug was alive. It was the truth that someone was weaponizing the entire memory of Fairmont Crest. Once memory is bent out of shape, every loyalty begins to rot. Every old wound can be reopened and reused. And anyone who believed the past had already been buried would have to pay for it in the present. In that storm of suspicion, betrayal, and anger, Jacob was no longer an ordinary investigator. He became the man carrying the most dangerous question of all. If the final truth really was Doug, would exposing it be enough to destroy the Plasma Syndicate? Or would it simply blow Fairmont Crest apart because one death had long served as the foundation for too many tragedies? Because there are some secrets that, once unearthed, save no one. They only split open old wounds again and reveal that even those who thought themselves innocent had already dirtied their hands. And that is what makes this story so suffocatingly vicious. Jacob is moving closer to the truth, but that truth may not be light. It may be an abyss. One more step and he may see the true face of the person at the top. But one more step and his undercover identity may also be exposed completely. At that point, Joey will no longer hide behind ambiguity. They will no longer have safe silence, Randy will no longer have room to evade. And if Doug truly is alive in the shadows, he will not let Jacob leave the board with his soul intact. Because in this war, the ultimate goal may not be to kill him. It may be to break him so completely that even he no longer trusts what he has seen. Fairmont Crest is still lit at night. The hospital is still running. Familiar faces still move about as if nothing has cracked. But underneath it all, the Plasma Syndicate is trembling because a secret is about to claw its way out of the grave. And Jacob, though still standing, is dangerously close to the moment when he must choose between dragging the truth into the light or becoming the next corpse buried inside a perfectly fabricated story. When the dead can return as a kingpin, when the innocent may only be masterful deceivers, and when every clue may be a trap, then the most terrifying question is no longer who stands behind the plasma network. The most terrifying thing is that the final truth may be so cruel that none of them will ever be able to live as they once did once it is finally called by its real name.